Thank you. To resume, to continue this really intense discussion, which I much appreciate, and all of you for carrying on through this, we have our next panel, which we were talking a bit during the break, really revives some of the arguments we've been discussing, but takes it in very new directions and new places as well in this global study. So I'm just going to briefly introduce who's up here on stage and then let our moderator run the panel. So Matt Snip is a professor in the Department of Sociology. He's the Burnett C. and Mildred Finley Wolford Professor of Humanities and Sciences. He wears multiple hats. He's also the director of the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences Secure Data Center, and was formerly the director of our Committee for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. His voluminous publications, just to focus on the topics that really have struck me over time, is his work on demography and economic development, and the well-being, economic well-being of American ethnic minorities and American Indian education. With him is Karina Klus from the Department of Sociology as well, finishing her dissertation work. It's quite global in reach as well as focused in empirical research. And it's especially interesting, I'm struck by the continuity from previous discussions we've been having, Karina's investigation of community-based organizations, NGOs, and related in their support or not of ethnic and indigenous communities. And then to her left is Peter Cerenza. He comes to us from the London School of Economics, where he's a fellow in the Economic History Department. His research is also wide-ranging and deeply probing the questions of immigration and financial markets and institutions and business history. Finally, we have our moderator, very pleased to welcome Sharika Tiranagama, assistant professor from the Department of Anthropology. Your research that I'm fascinated in learning more about on the Sri Lankan Civil War and this sort of changing forms of ethnicization in the war-torn and civil conflict context. And with that, I turn it to you, Sharika. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I can invite you, Matt and Karina, to
Okay, I want to thank Roland and his colleagues here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for allowing us to be here with you today. I also want to mention two things I need to mention. One is that our colleague Dalika Cohn is also a Stanford PhD in anthropology. She just recently received her degree and just moved to Stockholm for a postdoctoral fellowship, and that's the reason she can't be with us today. I also want to apologize to Sharika. To my shock and dismay this morning, I realized that I had sent her an earlier version of our presentation today, not the one that I'm going to be sharing with you here today. I think this presentation and the issues we're going to bring before you today covers a number of things and sort of resonates with things that we've heard during the conference. But I hope that it brings a somewhat different kind of perspective as well in terms of thinking about the tensions between migration and immigration. So let's see if this works. Okay. And what we want to focus on is this conflict that exists between immigrant communities on the one hand and indigenous people on the other hand. And when I talk about indigenous people, I just want to use as a kind of a working definition is that the people who were there before the arrival of a settler state or before a colonial power conquered them and occupied their territory. So in this case, it would be American Indians in the United States, and then we're going to talk about more about the people of the state of Assam. Okay. There is a genuine tension that I think has been, that has gone for the most part unresolved in relations between immigrant populations and indigenous people. And that is, on the one hand, you have the rights of indigenous populations, people who have occupied a land from time immemorial, and at the same time you have people who move in who have particular aspirations, who have left situations that were undesirable, unsafe, in search of a better life. And so for the most part, indigenous rights tend to be the rights of self-government and political freedom, the right to determine who is a member of their community, and most importantly and significantly is that they also have territorial rights. By rights of occupation, by rights of use, these groups claim territory for their very sustenance and survival. But as I said, you also have immigrants who move for the purpose of seeking political freedom, for economic opportunity, and then it becomes the role of the state in terms of brokering these rights and aspirations, and then also trying to sort of to rectify the inherent conflicts that exist within the interests of settler states. I want to talk about two case studies, one that is mostly historical and one that is currently ongoing in India. And begin with the situation of the United States, because it's an older story and I think offers some lessons to be learned from the experience of the conflict that has taken place in this country, mostly in the 19th century. You know, and as I think about, you know, the rights of immigrants, on one hand, my own personal background is my father's Oklahoma Cherokee and my mother's was Oklahoma Choctaw, and so I'm indigenous, and so, you know, I'm in my mind I somehow have these debates, because on the one hand I think about the sort of current immigration situation we have in this country, and then on the other hand I think about, well, what immigration actually meant for my family. And then I also have to reflect back too, is that, you know, if you think about the history of failed immigration policies, probably one of the older ones was the one that failed in 1492. This is just a map illustrating the various groups and societies that existed in what is now the continental United States. As you can see, there's a multitude of different groups, each with their own language, culture, history, religion, sustenance patterns, settlement patterns, and ways of living. Okay. And this is just really just to kind of give you a sense of sort of the cultural and political and economic complexity that existed prior to the arrival of Europeans. The population of the United States, of course, after the formation of the United States, grew very dramatically, and I think the next presentation is going to speak to that, because the Irish were one of the groups that contributed very significantly to the growth of the United States, among others. But as you can see, the population of the United States grew very dramatically over this century. And at the same time, oops, wrong button. At the same time, the American Indian population continued to dwindle in the same period, and sort of reached a low point in the last decade of the 19th century. Much of this population decline was due to epidemic diseases that periodically swept through the native population in the 19th century, but it was also due to things such as sort of an ongoing state of warfare between the United States and these various groups, as well as changes in sustenance patterns and declining health and the like. Beginning with the arrival of Europeans, and I'm going to focus primarily on the English, because the English are in fact sort of the most important colonial powers in thinking about relationships between American Indians and Europeans, because it was really the English that set the template that was later adopted by the United States. But there was a long period of violent conflict between a variety of different groups. One of the longest and bloodiest and earliest took place between the English colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. And then the last one took place in Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. And that was the last official military engagement between the United States and an American Indian tribe. The ways that these conflicts were addressed, for the most part, was through the negotiation of various sorts of treaties. And these treaties, of course, in the sort of the particulars, differed a great deal from one group to another, and especially in relation to the intensity of the conflict. But there were certain features that almost all of these treaties had in common. One involved land cessions by the indigenous tribes in exchange for some sort of guarantee of land that they would retain. There was a recognition of the United States. There were annuities, payments for the land cessions that the tribes gave up. And then probably most significantly was in almost all of these treaties were promises about non-encroachment, that once that the treaty was resolved, that there would be no further encroachments on tribal lands. And of all the provisions of these treaties that was probably most frequently broken, this was the one that was almost inexorably broken, and was the one that proved to be most problematic. I want to sort of flesh out that previous point about non-encroachment. And talk a bit about the French and Indian War and its counterpart in Europe, which was the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was won fairly decisively by the British in Europe. But the French and Indian War was much closer to a stalemate. Of course, the British did win it. But it was one in which cost them a great deal of resources. It also involved the loss of a great deal of British lives. And at the end of the British, or at the end of the 7 years in the French and Indian War in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, King George and his court followed on with something called the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was an attempt by the king to normalize relations and with the various Indian tribes that had allied themselves with France during the French and Indian War. And the purpose of this was not only to normalize relations, but in a sense set a set of standards that would minimize and reduce the conflict between the colonies on the one hand and the various tribes that surrounded them on the other. And so one of the first things that, or one of the early provisions of the proclamation was that the colonies no longer possess the power to negotiate directly with the tribes, that in future negotiations, future relations with the various Indian tribes that surrounded the colonies of Britain, the agents of the king would negotiate directly and not agents of the colonists. It also established ethical trade practices for dealing with the tribes, so that things, credit relations and other kinds of business dealings had to meet a certain standard, and that they would also be monitored by agents of the king. It forbid further encroachment on tribal lands, and it specifically called for the settlement or the restrictions of settlements to the east of that should be the west of the Allegheny Mountains. That in fact settlers living west of the Alleghenies were to return to the east. Okay. This, of course, was an enormously unpopular set of measures. The colonists resisted it, denounced it. And if you think about that famous episode in American history, the Boston Tea Party, recall who the Tea Partiers dressed as. They could have dressed as themselves. They could have dressed as African slaves. They could have dressed as a lot of things, but they chose to dress as American Indians, and this was sort of, in a sense, to represent their grievances against the king with respect to the Royal Proclamation and in the Declaration of Independence. There's also a couple of statements, declarations against the king and the things that he had done in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And in fact, it was so unpopular that the king eventually was forced to rescind the proclamation in 1770. And so it ceased to have any force. Now the reason, so in addition to this history that I've just shared with you about the Royal Proclamation, The other reason that it's so important is because it also sets the template for what the Americans did once they had independence from the king, so that the measures of the Royal Proclamation were basically the same measures that the United States in dealing with American Indians going forward. And what I've put up here is not, I'm not going to sort of walk through all of these, but this is really to kind of illustrate the amount of conflict that takes place mostly over the course of the 19th century between American Indians and the United States and various groups of settlers on the frontier. And so, you know, to kind of give you a sense of the numbers and sort of the sheer volume, that this was something that there was a state of endemic war that existed in this country right up until about 1890. Now, in terms of what is taking place in Northeast India, this is many of the things that I just mentioned about, you know, relations between indigenous people and the United States could be brought to bear on what we're watching in India today. Okay? The location of India of Assam is to the far right. You see that territory that's located above Bangladesh and Burma. That is what we think of as Northeast India. Okay? It's connected by this sort of geographic umbilical cord to the rest of India. The people of Assam tend to refer to India as the mainland. And if you talk to sort of common conversations with most Indians who live in the mainland, they know relatively little about the state of Assam. This territory of Northeast India was carved out through conquest and consolidation of a number of feudal states by the British in the 19th century. Okay? And so you have this sort of very large territory up in the court that's bordered by Bhutan, Myanmar, China, and Bangladesh. And after independence in the 1950s, you had a number of these various tribes, the larger ones, who began demanding their own independent states. That they did not want to be part of India. They did not want to be part of Assam. And the compromise was the creation of a number of these smaller tribal-based states. So, for example, you can see if they're to the far right on Nagaland, our colleague Dalika Kone is a member of the Naga tribe. Right? There are more than 200 distinct ethnic groups and hundreds of other sub-ethnic communities. The largest of these, this is the largest concentration of indigenous peoples in India. Should say that Assam has a relationship with the mainland, which is, in a sense, very much like it has all the markings of a colonial state, and that is, Assam tends to export raw materials in the form of agricultural products, coal, oil, and gas to the mainland. And the principal agricultural product in Assam is tea production. The state of Assam is one of the largest tea producers in the world. This is a Bangladeshi woman who is working in the tea plantation, picking the tea leaves. And what you have here is a hut that is occupied by one of these Bangladeshi families that works on the tea plantations. What has happened is that the boundaries of the tea plantations and the boundaries of the municipalities and the various districts within the state of Assam are very well defined. What is not well defined are the lands that are claimed and believed to be possessed by these various tribes. And we have a situation today where you have mostly Bangladeshi immigrants coming into the state of Assam to work in the tea plantations, and then in need of housing, simply building a house or a hut or some sort of shelter on property that is claimed by these tribes. In July of 2012, the Bodo tribe got tired of this situation that they had been complaining to the state of India and the state of Assam that this was taking place and that it was encroaching on their land. And so in the July of 2012, they picked up guns and attacked a number of these villages. And in fact, by the time it was all done, they had killed something like 80 people. And so this is early, this says 30, but in the end it was around 80, and sent a couple of 100,000 people fleeing into refugee camps. This is another example of ethnic violence that's taken place. This time it's against the immigrants coming in from Myanmar, again sort of occupying tribal land that is sort of in dispute. And then most recently, you have a tribe, the Karbi tribe, which has decided that they would like to have their own state. And so as recently as August 4th, there was an outbreak of violence along in the Diffu district. And actually, I happened to be over in India last spring, and actually had the opportunity to visit a Karbi village, and this is one of our meetings. The immigration from Bangladesh is probably the most serious one, and it's one that probably is going to sort of intensify over time, particularly with climate change. Much of Bangladesh is slated to be underwater over the next 50 to 100 years, and it's expected that many of those Bangladeshis will have no choice but to move north. There's also an issue about Chinese dams along the Brahmaputra River. The Arunachal Pradesh, which is mostly an indigenous population, is the group that's most likely to be impacted. And I'm going to have to speed along here a bit. And so, what to do? Well, one of the things that we could contemplate, and people have contemplated, is moving beyond colonialism and looking for a way, some sort of means of achieving a rapprochement between indigenous peoples and these immigrants. And I'm just going to sort of jump past this. This deals with sort of a discussion of how do we obtain data for indigenous societies to monitor these issues. And of course, the very question of who's indigenous is a complicated one that perhaps we can take up later. But in 2007, there is a framework that was put forth by the United Nations. It was a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I don't have time to sort of go through all of this, but it culminated about close to, well, over 20 years of struggle by various indigenous groups, including many American Indians, for some sort of recognition from the United Nations. When the Declaration was ratified by the UN in 2007, the only 4 countries refusing to sign on to the document was the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. All of those countries have since signed on, and what it does is it establishes a set of minimum standards for the survival and dignity of indigenous societies. And as I said, I'm to the end of my talk, so I'll have to maybe save this for a conversation later. I should say that since the declaration was signed, there have been a number of countries, including India and Finland, who have said, well, we really didn't mean those things that we signed on to in 2007, and they sort of cite these objections, which also happen to be the same objections that the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada raised. And it's a way of trying to broker the engagement of indigenous peoples and sort of, in a sense, manage the rights of newcomers at the same time that you protect the rights and claims of native societies. And I'm going to have to quit there. So thank you very much.
Okay, so please.
Nope.
That's the next one. So that's okay. There's next. Great. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present at this conference, and I've, as a participant, I've certainly enjoyed the discussions that we've had over the last day and a half. And what I'm going to talk about today deals with the question of geography and how that impacts assimilation, how that impacts occupational mobility. And what I'm going to do is look at Irish immigrants in the U.S. At the end of the 19th century. And when I talk about geography, in particular, what I'm going to look at is the impact of enclaves, the impact of immigrants living in communities that are either more or less ethnically clustered or concentrated. And so that's really the focus of my talk today. And really, there are three questions that I'm going to try to address in the next 15 to 20 minutes. The first is, to what extent did geographic clustering exist for the Irish in this period in the late 19th century? Did it lead to a greater degree of assimilation? And when I look at assimilation, what I'm going to be doing is looking at the various socioeconomic characteristics that are available in U.S. Census data, which forms the basis of my data. And then I'm also going to look at the impact of clustering on the occupational mobility of Irish immigrants. And it is interesting that in the course of this conference, we've had other folks have touched on the question of enclaves and this morning's discussion of multiculturalism. Rand's paper yesterday noted that immigrant enclaves tended to be associated with reduced occupational mobility, even for second-generation immigrants. And so I'm gonna look at this question, this issue, as it relates to the Irish. So why the Irish? What drew me to look at the Irish was that they were, in this time frame, they were the biggest leavers from Europe. So per capita, you had more Irish immigrants leaving Ireland for the U.S., Canada, Australia, and other places than any other immigrant group. Why the U.S.? Because most of them went to the U.S. Looking at assimilation relative to the Irish also makes sense because they had very, very low rates of return migration. Probably the only other group in this time frame that had similarly low single-digit rates of return migration back to their original country would have been the Jews. So in that sense, it's very interesting to look at the Irish. And although this is historical and it's over a century ago, maybe there are some lessons about the impact of enclaves, geographic clustering on contemporary questions of immigrant assimilation. And just quickly, in terms of the literature, there's been a lot of debate about the impact of ethnic enclaves on assimilation. Portes and Rimbaud, for one, found that the political advantages that could be available in ethnic enclaves could lead to upward mobility. Gordon noted the value of ethnic enclaves as a network, and then specifically for the Irish, McCaffrey and McKivigan and Robertson, focused on networks and support systems available to Irish immigrants in the cities of the Northeast, and access to employment in local government jobs such as policemen, firemen, transit workers, teachers, et cetera, in trade unions, and also in the church. So there's certainly literature that would suggest that enclaves are a good thing as it relates to occupational mobility. On the other hand, there's also a fair number of folks who have looked at this issue and believe that geographic clustering or ethnic enclaves reduces or delays immigrant assimilation. Borjas found that this was particularly true in in groups that had lower levels of human capital. And then more recently, Cutler et al. Looked at this question and found that perhaps it's a bit nuanced, that in some, for some groups, there were positive labor market and educational outcomes. But again, human capital seems to play a role in terms of more negative outcomes with lower levels of human capital. In terms of the data, again, I'm going to, not unlike Ram's presentation yesterday, I'm using IPM's data, which is drawn from U.S. Census data, to construct the sample. I'm also using the University of Virginia historical census browser, which has the benefit of being not a sample, but 100%. And I use that to construct measures of geographic clustering, which I'm able to do down to the county level. And so interlaying the University of Virginia data on top of the IPM's sample in order to come up with a sample for which I have very significant socioeconomic characteristics of Irish immigrants in the workforce in 1900, and then being able to also estimate the geographic clustering. Now, this is a map in 1900 which basically shows the percentage of first-generation Irish-born immigrants in the U.S. By county. And basically, the darker areas represent the areas where the percentage of Irish immigrants relative to the percentage of the population in a given county is high. And as we'll see, Suffolk, Massachusetts in 1900 was had the highest level of clustering of Irish first-generation immigrants. More than 12% of the population of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, were Irish. What you also would note from looking at this chart is that the Northeast, as you might expect, is one region where you have very significant clustering of Irish. Generally speaking, with the absence of a few mining towns that we'll touch on in a second, like Story and Silver Bow, Nevada, and Deer Lodge, Montana, I think it is, that basically the South and the West are not areas where the Irish tended to go. In fact, of the roughly 3,500 counties that existed in the U.S. in 1900, there were almost 2,200 of them where the Irish made up less than 1% of the population. And there were also another 379 counties where the Irish made up less than 1/100th of 1%, and 378 of the 379 of those were in the South and the West. So there certainly is very significant clustering of the Irish in places that many of you would have guessed. Now, this chart basically shows the top 25 counties ranked by basically the percentage of the population that were Irish immigrants. So it's not by number, it's by intensity of kind of the enclave. and what's very clear from looking at this chart is that, again, with the absence of Story, Nevada, where you had a relatively small number of people doing mining work, that this is really very much a story of Irish immigrants in the major cities in the Northeast, and and that's probably what you would expect to see. Now, what I also did was, I looked at, okay, well, let's look, what were some of the other big immigrant groups in this time frame? And the other really big immigrant groups were the Germans and the Brits, basically. Technically, the Irish were Brits, but I'll look at the English and the Scottish. And what you can see, when we look at these other large immigrant groups, is that, well, they all didn't go to the same places with the same intensity. The Germans, Wisconsin is a very big destination. We're very, very significant concentration of German immigrants in the Midwest, and a much greater emphasis, if you look at the data, in farming, in many respects more like native-born Americans, more rural, more engaged in agriculture, whereas the Irish were much more urban. If we look at the English, again, well, Bailey's not a very good example in terms of numbers, but again, if you look at the places where the English were most concentrated on a percentage basis, again, it looks a little bit different from the Irish. Again, obviously, there were a lot of English that lived in major cities in the Northeast, but some of the places where they were most concentrated were presumably places where they went to engage in work. And here's the Scots, and the overall Scots percentage was much, much lower, but again, it has a very different look from the U.S. Now, one other thing interesting to show is I also looked at the same analysis of clustering going back as far as I could get good data, which was to 1870. And as you can see, if you go back to 1870 again, there was this big concentration of Irish in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and then in certain areas in the West. It's a slightly deceptive map because the really, really big colored areas are probably the least people. But what you see is that as far back as 1870, and then 1880, and 1890, that there were very large percentages of Irish in the West. And what that would indicate to me, just looking at the data overall, is that prior settlement seems to have been a big factor for the Irish tended to go. That major ports, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, were also important destinations for Irish immigrants, as was the, in smaller numbers but with reasonable intensity, following job opportunities in mining and other areas that would have taken them further afield. So those seem to have been factors that influenced where they settled. Now, the next thing I did was to look at my sample data and to break it into above average and below average levels of geographic clustering. And so for my sample of 26,000 Irish immigrants, I was then able to look at these two groups and also compare them to a sample that I put together of native-born. And so what I take away from this, if you'll have a look at this slide, and then that slide, if you look at that data, what you see is that the Irish that were that had lower levels, below average levels of clustering, tended to be more rural. They tended to be more likely to own a home. They also tended to be more likely to marry a spouse who wasn't Irish, so much more likely to intermarry. And they also had lower levels of infant mortality. That could also relate to the fact that they were less urban, potentially. And in all those respects, they more closely resembled the native-born than the Irish who were from more clustered areas. The only place where we see the above-average clustered Irish more resembling the native-born is in literacy, but that's not a huge issue because in all cases, more than 9 out of 10 of the immigrants are literate. So while it's true, it's not a very significant difference. Right. Okay. So then moving to occupational mobility. Again, what I do here is I've separated my sample into those immigrants who lived in more clustered, more ethnically concentrated areas and less concentrated areas. And then I also, building on the work of Stephen Thernstrom, developed a list of, or categorization of occupations, because there wasn't very good income data in this period. So being able to categorize occupations is really probably the best way to look at, occupational mobility. And so when I look at farmers, what I did there, those are people who own farms or manage farms. So if you were a simple farm laborer, you would then be in the unskilled category. And again, what you can see here is that while the differences don't appear extreme, it is certainly the case that the more ethnically concentrated Irish were less likely to be in high white collar, low white collar, or farming, and they were much more likely to be in semi or unskilled work. Now, one of the limitations of this sort of work is that it doesn't control for other factors. So time in the U.S. is obviously a very big factor. You know, if someone has just arrived, they're very unlikely to own a farm. That sort of thing would take time. So the next, oh, thank you, yeah. So right, so there we go. So the next thing I did was I looked at a logistic regression that would allow me to figure out the likelihood of an Irish immigrant being in one of my occupational categories, and then controlling for all those factors on the bottom, which would then enable me to isolate on, in particular, the impact of geographic clustering on occupation mobility and where they're likely to be. And so what this outcome shows, which I was very happy to see, was that in every case, with the exception of the unskilled, these results are very statistically significant. And this is a marginal effects calculation. And basically what it shows is that that higher levels of clustering were negatively related to being in high white collar, low white collar, and farming, and positively related to being in skilled or in semi-skilled work. And whereas the magnitudes don't seem very big, they actually are pretty significant in that the high white collar category was about 8% of the sample, so a 2% change off of an 8% base is really about a 25% difference. So the magnitudes actually are quite meaningful. And so again, so what this would suggest quite strongly is that to the extent immigrants lived in more ethnically concentrated areas with other Irish immigrants, that seems to have impacted their occupational outcomes in 1900. And then moving quickly, I also did a calculation of using a Duncan dissimilarity index, which basically allows you to look at two distributions and to say what, compare them and be able to say what percentage of the distribution would have to change to resemble the other. And again, using different measures of clustering, what you find is that clustering does seem to have a big impact on outcomes, that the distribution of occupations is more and more different the more and more you segregate between levels of clustering. Moving along, I also then took calculated for each occupation the average level of clustering of Irish immigrants in a particular county for each occupation, and then sum that up into occupational groups. And again, what you see here is that and a lower clustering ratio implies a lower level of clustering. And what this basically again shows is that high white collar, low white collar, certainly farming, are associated with lower levels of clustering, and that this clustering ratio is highest for skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled work. And then going back to the literature, where you have, certain folks have suggested that these networks were very powerful and had particular success in helping in particular, Irish immigrants have success in city government jobs and unionized jobs. So I went and looked specifically for different types of occupations. And the first category are high white collar categories, where you can see where this clustering ratio is quite low, which for clergy actually surprised me, because I would have thought that you might find that that Irish immigrants who were in the Catholic Church would have been in more ethnically concentrated areas, but it's not terribly high, which I found interesting. The second grouping, lumbermen and mines and railroad related, those are more jobs that tended to be unionized around 1900. And again, in this case, again, the level of clustering again is not terribly high, and it's reasonably low. So again, it wouldn't tend to support this notion that ethnic enclaves are related to success in finding work as a lumberman or on the railroads. The next grouping represents kind of local government jobs, firemen, policemen, motormen. And again, the clustering ratio is not that high. It's probably right about in the middle of the distribution, which again wouldn't suggest that enclaves were critical to success in finding work as a fireman or policeman. The jobs that did tend to have higher levels of clustering possibly were ones, well, aside from textiles, possibly were jobs that were related to serving the local immigrant community, which could make sense in terms of drivers and waiters and so forth. So really, what I came away from this was I didn't really see a lot of evidence, very scarce evidence, for the impact of geographic clustering on having success in particular areas where some prior authors have thought that would have been the case. So then moving to conclusion, so what have we found? We found that the Irish were highly concentrated. I don't think anyone would be surprised by that. Anyone who's ever been to Boston will certainly not be surprised by that. Settlement patterns seem to have been influenced by proximity to ports of entry, again, New York, Boston, Philadelphia in particular. Obviously, employment, something we've seen a lot in this conference. And then also, kind of network information affects settlement choices of earlier immigrants seems to affect where Irish have chosen to live. And also that higher levels of geographic clustering are associated with lower levels of assimilation and lower levels of occupational outcomes. And then in particular, as I mentioned, that there didn't seem to be evidence supporting the notion that it really helped get you into a job in city government or union work. And in terms of the literature, would tend to support the view that that geographic clustering does in fact delay immigrant assimilation. Again, this nicely ties, thankfully, with Ron's presentation yesterday, where he found that enclaves held back second-generation immigrants. He was looking across, I think, 16 different immigrant groups, and also ties nicely with the discussion that we had last night and again today, relative to issues of multiculturalism and so forth. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
So thank you, Peter and Matt and Karina, for great presentations. I'm sorry that we had to hurry you along a little bit, and thank you very much for Roland for inviting me to be the discussant, and also Matt for suggesting me. And I'll try my best to throw out a few observations, because I want to allow as much time for discussion and also for both paper presenters to expand on any parts if they want to. So I'll just sort of throw out a few questions to both papers and then open it up. And my background in this is that I work on Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan Civil War. So one of the things that I found very interesting, especially in relation to your paper, Matt, is that I work on two different ethnic minorities, Sri Lankan Tamils and Sri Lankan Muslims, who are both discriminated against in different ways, and who actually also, I look at the sort of relationship between them and the conflict actually that emerges between them in relation to external military actors too. So there is an issue here which I do want to follow you up on how do two marginal groups, how do they relate to each other, which I think is a very significant one more generally. And some of my work has also been on Sri Lankan Tamil migrants in Toronto and in London. So I've definitely observed the ethnic clustering effect very strongly, especially in Toronto. So I just have a couple of questions, if I can start with your paper, Matt and Karina. I think it's great to compare Native American communities and indigenous communities in India, because it raises both points of the points of similarity and the points of difference raise some very thought-provoking issues, because it is about colonial settler states. It is also about two countries in which the solution or the set of issues have very much been about land and statehood. So the question of reservations or land grabs here in the US and in India, the right to self-determination or statehood or conferring statehood has been a tried and tested way for the Indian state to try and appease issues which inevitably doesn't quite appease because there are much larger issues around rights which are not fully covered by questions of statehood. And the same is true in the US, of course, in contemporary Native American communities, that issues of land rights are not exhaustive of all of the issues of marginalization that relate. So those are some of the interesting points of similarity. I think what is a point of difference, and I think it points to the part in the paper you didn't get to, which is very much of the matter, is the question of indigeneity, or how does one categorize indigeneity? Because in the US it's very clear that you have a time immemorial community, so to speak, or the First Nation principle is quite well established in the US, and that has set in many ways the standard for how indigeneity is imagined. In India it's much more unclear because many communities who are called tribal were called tribal by the British for a number of under British colonialism for a number of different reasons. Some of them are nomadic and therefore qualified for them as tribal. Some of them were the time immemorial principle. So you have all kinds of different groups, some with land, some without land, who become categorized as tribal communities in 19th century Britain. And some of them are criminalized, some of them are recruited large scale into the British Army because they're considered martial. So it's a much, much more complicated way in which tribal identity has been categorized. So it's interesting, and I want to ask you about that, is how indigeneity now is in fact being understood, because indigeneity is a global category. It's not necessarily an Indian category, but it's very much one which is embraced and being used in a global context within India to gain rights for marginalized communities. But it becomes interesting then how one judges between, in Assam you have indigenous groups who have land rights, like the Bodo, but then you have Adivasis who are tribal communities from other parts of India who have come there to work. And even among Bangladeshi migrants and Muslims, you also have communities who might be considered indigenous too. So I don't want to give the impression that every presentation about India has to be endlessly complicated. But and the demographies get out of control. But I am interested in asking you to tell us a little bit more about how one thinks about indigeneity. Because I think you're right that this conflict between immigrants and indigenous people is a very important and a question that can be asked globally, in fact. And so, Pete, I feel, in fact, that as Matt is the demographer here, I should be deputizing my questions. But I am, in my own inexpert anthropological way, going to ask you some questions about your paper. And if you don't mind, my questions will be not so much about the measurement issues, but more in a kind of Weberian way about categories of social being, or how immigrants imagine themselves, which matters a great deal in questions of ethnic clustering and in questions of work. Because in some ways, what you're able to do with the data is measure assimilation in a very particular way, which is, marrying non-American spouses, for example, or occupational mobility of a particular kind. But that's assimilation. It's not necessarily the same thing as integration as we might consider it now, or other models of imagining how people might settle and live in a country. You can settle and live in a country and consider yourself to belong there without marrying somebody outside of your ethnic or religious community. For example, you may choose, maybe it in a sense of success, it may not display very much in terms of occupational mobility, but you may have a preference for certain kinds of work, for example, which may, in one sense, not be considered integration, but in another sense might be also part of a settling in a country and inhabiting it, or becoming part of that country. So those, I think, are some kinds of issues which the data doesn't necessarily give us any idea of, and which which makes assimilation, it's a problematic term in that context. And one of the things that I'm intrigued that you bring up the German, the Scots, and the English, and then you have the Irish in contrast, because of course religion is a big issue in terms of Catholicism, Protestant migration. If you look at Britain and you look at Irish migration, every major city in Britain, Liverpool, or up in Scotland, Glasgow, Manchester, they have a distinct divisions between Protestant and Catholic populations, right down to the football teams, and everything. So those kind of things are also about forms of clustering or community belonging, why you might choose, in fact, to be part of a particular community, and which might impel you to choose one kind of destination over another, which is to be part of a religious community. And in which sense, where you can measure large numbers of people going into unskilled labor, but you can only measure a few people going into white-collar labor, well, the white-collar, those jobs like clergymen and so on are differently weighted in terms of power. You don't need to have 100 clergymen to even 5 can make an impact within a community in terms of offering prestige or offering opportunities and so on. So the kind of networks, if you think of social networks and what individuals are able to do in social networks, certain kinds of individuals are more networked than others and offer more nodes to other people in a sense than others. So that's why even if you have a very small percentage of these white-collar workers, they are nonetheless in some ways very significant in how they are able to manage or open particular kinds of doors or close others. So I mean, these are, so I'm quite, in some ways I know it's a little unfair because your paper is very much about what the data can tell you. So I want to, and my questions are all about what the data in fact doesn't tell us, but I'm interested if you think about migration then as a more general phenomenon, not just from the 19th century, but relatable to now, how these other sorts of things around migrants and chain migration, how that would actually factor into how you might think about your paper. So I'll stop there, and we can, if there are any questions right now, we can take some questions. Oh, we have, okay, and then I'll give you a chance to answer later on. So
I have 2 questions to Peter. The first is addressing causality. You conclude that geographical clusters delays assimilation, but you can turn around the causality. You can say the unsuccessful migrants are staying in the clustered geographical areas because they have not the financial resources to leave it. So, but the reason for delayed assimilation is not the cluster. These are other factors. I would be interested, what is your opinion? And the second is, if your conclusion is correct, clustering delays assimilation, then I would know what would you advise to politicians? Should you avoid geographical clustering? Should you forbid it? Do you want to plan housing policy into certain to specific circumstances? What would you advise to city politicians or other ones?
Right. Good. Thank you. Yeah, causation certainly is a question. Is an issue, and so I certainly accept that. So for example, is someone successful, or successful? It's probably not a good term. Does someone achieve a higher occupational outcome if and they also married a non-Irish spouse? Is that the influence of the spouse, or is there a certain other attribute that I'm not measuring or capturing that might have also had an influence, right? So one of the issues with getting a whole bunch of variables and looking at them is people measure what they're able to measure. So for example, the U.S. Census in 1900 didn't ask religion, so that element you can try to infer in certain ways, but unfortunately you don't have access. So you are certainly limited by the variables that are available to you. So causation is always a question. So certainly there is a relationship between, clustering and, and assimilation and occupational mobility. One thing I did make very sure to control for was the time in the U.S., because certainly when immigrants first arrive, they're more likely to, initially come into, the port areas in the U.S., and they're much less likely to be able to either travel further distances or certainly go into farming, for example, which would have required a very significant investment in time and in money to be able to, to go into that sort of an occupation. So certainly controlling for these variables, I think, is very important in order to try to, tease out some relationships. As it relates to policy, again, what I looked at was socioeconomic measurements primarily and occupation. So obviously there are many other factors that influence people's well-being and how they live and how they think about themselves that are unrelated to that, for which being in an ethnic community could be extremely valuable and important. So I'd be very hesitant to say that, well, just because we have, this evidence, then we shouldn't allow people to live near other people who come from a similar place. That certainly would be a very tricky thing. But it is certainly interesting that this relationship does seem to be in the data in this time frame for this group.
So I also wanted to follow up. First of all, the data that you have is, Pete, is really interesting, and it seems like you most likely, because it resonates with some other research. It seems like you have the right story, and it's hard to tell as in these quick presentations all the data analysis that went into it. But I had just a couple of questions or suggestions about ways you could push the data analysis to be perhaps even more convincing. And one is related to your comment, is whether there's threshold effects. So I had, at least as I understood it, you were dividing the data between below average and above average clustering, okay? And there's a lot of counties that have very low levels of Irish immigrants, as you described it. And so I wonder whether the possible, positive effects of clustering are something we observe only in the fairly high, really high groups when we're looking at, maybe over 5% or even 8%, and just to see whether things look any different when we focus on those really high cluster groups. Another thing is it, at least in your presentation, and again, it may have been on the slides and I just missed it, you were very much focused on controlling for individual characteristics of the immigrants. And I wondered whether you wanted to push your analysis to, focus on, finding the good matches. So I was thinking about New Haven, since I live there, and it's like, what is the good match for New Haven? And I'm thinking, is it Dayton, Ohio, or Youngstown, Ohio? I didn't see them on your data, and since they're in the Midwest, where all the characteristics might look like New Haven, absent the fact that there's just not so many Irish. So looking for the best possible match, and so we're not comparing, New Haven to, Topeka, Kansas, and so trying to get those comparisons, this seems like a great starting point, but then just narrowing down to even better matches for the places where we observe those big clusters, I think would allow you to, perhaps be even more convincing in showing this pattern in the data that is really remarkable. Yeah. So are those things have you looked at yet?
I haven't. No, I haven't actually. So those are both very good suggestions. yeah, certainly from a presentation standpoint, just initially breaking it into certain groups
Sure.
is, if you can look at it on a continuous, as a continuous variable, then it's much more.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
it
much
might
more
not
useful.
be linear.
Yeah.
And so I think the categories is probably the right way to think about it, but just moving the threshold around
Yeah,
a little.
yeah, I
and
think
just
moving
show
around could be
no
interesting.
matter where you look at it, you don't see these clustering effects.
You're right, yeah.
I mean, of course, some historians have pointed out the Irish made the biggest leap, which was to become white in America.
Sorry?
The Irish became white in America, where they were not white in Europe. So that could be categorized as the biggest socially mobile moment for the Irish, regardless of.
Yeah, well, there's two groups of Irish. I mean, before the 1840s, there was substantial immigration that was completely different because it was more urban to urban, and it was much more Protestant and wealthier. And then after the famine in the late 1840s, you get this sea change, and obviously those Irish would have felt much different, and it may also explain why the return migration is so low. I mean, it makes a lot of sense why Jewish migrants were not thinking of going back to where they came from. But it is striking how different the return migration is for the Irish versus most other groups, and it relates exactly to that sort of notion. Absolutely. Yeah.
The first group used to be referred to as the lace curtain Irish.
Okay.
May I respond to your question? Yes. So thank you for asking that, because actually my interests come from the global perspective and meet Matt with the more historical perspective. So this issue of the political issues around who is and is not Indigenous is really kind of at the heart of my research. So it started by way of looking at the global Indigenous rights movement, and Matt mentioned I'm going to use a working definition. What's important to note that it's not just Matt that's using a working definition, everyone's using a working definition, because there is no agreed upon single definition of who is and who is not. So to your point, in one way there's some very important lessons we can learn from the example here in the United States, but the differences do come around the clarity of who is and is not Indigenous. So when we look across Africa and Asia in particular, it's really fascinating to see where we do and do not see different ethnic communities appropriating or asserting these Indigenous identities. And so my introduction to Northeast India, the group of people here in the South Asian Institute, the sense I got was, 10 or 15 years ago, we started hearing the word Indigenous being used in Northeast India. So when I spent a month there, I was asking questions around who is, people's reactions to this identification as being Indigenous. So there's really two layers of additional complexity to that, and one is the migration patterns, and as we gestured towards, there's more than 200 distinct ethnic communities, and if we'd been able to kind of expand a bit more and shown the maps of the migration patterns, do make this issue of who is and is not a very complex issue. The second one is, while India has signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they, like many other states throughout Africa and Asia, do not recognizing having a quote-unquote indigenous population in their country. Places like Botswana say, well, yes, we're all indigenous. Places like India say, yes, that's great, but we don't have quote-unquote indigenous populations here. So the word tribal is really important in India, because recognition of scheduled tribe status is really important in the institutional sense of India. And so when you talk to people, I had an interesting experience where you ask about indigenous, and there's more kind of a political institutional effort to be recognized as a scheduled tribe because of the rights that come with that. And there were certain parts in the far northeast of Assam that people just really weren't comfortable with that. That being said, we do see the Boda, for example, in the conflicts where this language around indigenous is being used more around the rights issues. So I think that there's not necessarily the solutions, but understanding the complexity in Northeast India. The Boda, for example, have scheduled tribe recognition, which also they've been recognized as an autonomous council. So there is a little bit more clarity on, or more granting of autonomy, but their own land borders still aren't clearly identified and recognized, and they're in a minority of the indigenous groups that would claim as being indigenous or tribal throughout India who still don't have recognition of a scheduled tribe. So that this issue expands much, much further. So just to say, yes, the issue is complex. The complexity of who is indigenous and land rights is something that is all, throughout the world, but especially in Africa and Asia, where there isn't clarity on who is and isn't indigenous, and where those land rights come into conflict with whether it's immigration and migration patterns, whether it's natural resource extraction from the government, or other land issues. But it's really a global phenomenon that is very complex in India, but it's a global phenomenon that's going to continue to be a big challenge.
I don't know if there are any more questions. Perhaps to expand on this, maybe you could just talk a little bit also about the conflict between migration and indigeneity in India as it pertains back to the U.S.
Well, I think that the interesting thing about, well, the U.S. and India, but also in other parts of the world as well, Latin America especially, what you have is, in a sense, two marginalized groups, both competing for scarce resources, and both with legitimate claims on those resources. And then it's up to the state to mediate those claims. Now, in the United States, that conflict there was no ambiguity in terms of which side the United States took. They were willing to send the army out to defend the rights of these new immigrants to the detriment of the indigenous populations. I think in the case of India, the response of the Indian government is much more ambiguous. In the past, they would have responded by creating a new autonomous state by carving some land out of the state of Assam. The Assamese are no longer having any of that. And so these new claims from groups like the Karbi for their own territories is not one that's a viable strategy for the national government. And I think the national government, sort of sends mixed signals. That on the one hand, they're very welcoming of these immigrants who are coming to work and that they need the labor, but at the same time, these indigenous communities have been very active in defending their rights. They're well armed, many of them. They're in some cases well financed by people suspect probably China. And so the Indian government is facing a multitude of these armed insurrections across the Northeast. Now, in terms of who is and who qualifies for recognition and who doesn't, that is sort of, as Karina mentioned, that's a very, very knotty, complicated issue in India. But I'd also add that it's an issue that is still unsettled here in the United States, though it doesn't exist to the same magnitude or complexity you have in India. For example, in the United States, from time to time, the United States creates a new tribe of Indians. And they have within the Bureau of Indian Affairs something called the Office of Acknowledgement and Research. And so from time to time, we create a new tribe. And because the tribes have the autonomy to determine who can belong to the tribe and who doesn't, that changes from time to time, and sometimes that results in an addition of new tribal members, and sometimes, and more often than not lately, the expulsion of new tribal members. And so this business of who is and who isn't is an endlessly complicated question here and in India, and I can also say in Australia and New Zealand and most other parts of the world that I'm familiar with.
Question, comment to follow up exactly on this. I'm wondering if you have thought of or have some insights on two contemporary examples of this model, of this historical model of indigenous, or the interests of indigenous pitted against the interests of more recent immigrants. That is, for instance, in China right now, of course, we know of the western region of the Uyghur people protesting the redistribution of resources in commercial districts and such over to Han communities that are identified as Han originating, who have been relocated by the central state. And so in a sense, it's almost as if contemporary government deploying this historical model that may have unfolded through historical circumstances. And the other question, or the other example I had for your comment is, so in the close region in Bhutan, there has been a policy by as you probably know, a policy by the monarchy to revive national custom, whether it's dress or food and such, and it's originally billed as part of nation building for pride to keep especially the younger generations on the farm, so to speak, or at least in the country. But it has come at the expense of Nepalese refugees and workers who are doing manual labor. And I'm wondering if these are examples of contemporary iterations of this conflict that you've evoked for us.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. As Sharika mentioned in her comments, you have, and in the Northeast, you have Adivasis who are tribal but not indigenous. And then you have other groups, the Singpho, who are indigenous. And the Adivasis are in the Northeast because the British moved them there for labor. So it's a global strategy,
Yeah.
and a global problem.
Do you think it's a colonial one, or a central state? I mean, in that sense.
Well, I don't know. Is China a colonial power?
Yes, right. It's a difficult. That would be a difficult
Yeah.
one to argue. But I mean, certainly, it raises some of the issues around the U.S. in the 19th century, around societies with very complex, multiple communities all at the same time, rather than sort of one or two clearly identified minority.
And South Africa is another good example of that. So again, in kind of that region, people, if it's indigenous requires the comparison of one group to another, right? So a lot of places in Africa, indigenous means the not colonial powers. So once the English and Afrikaner lost, basically, weren't ruling the South African government, there since has been more attention to the San or Baswara Bushman populations, indigenous populations in South Africa. But again, the complication around, you've had the high Malaysian population, high Indian population, immigrants, the Afrikaner, the English, and then the local and majority Zulu in South Africa. And then here you have a very small indigenous population. But yes, it's another clear example in this indigenous population. If you look at the census in South Africa, they're lumped in this category of colored. So you have black, white, Indian, and colored. And colored is obviously a very uncomfortable terminology when you get there, come to the United States, is, what is this? And it's this very kind of murky category of usually interracial between black, white, and or Asian, but also these indigenous have been lumped into this category, and there's since been a revival and somewhat of a movement around identifying and recognizing the indigenous tribes and indigenous lands and indigenous rights. But yeah, it's another example of the complexity of different migration patterns.
If I also then, on that, if I can go back to you, Peter, and ask you about this question about because certainly this comes around the time in the U.S. where very soon afterwards you have all the bills on who can migrate and who, the differentiation between the European migrants who all become European in some senses, rather than being Northern or the Nordics versus the Italians, all of these are coming around this time of the mass Irish migration too, right? And I'm sort of intrigued then, so your data can't measure that, but this question of race really, and how the Irish then become part of the U.S. as a sort of, not as the original settlers, but part of the
Sure.
as a settler
You know, I mean, and
community.
religion, I think, is also a big factor because along with the Germans, you know, these were really the first two large, you know, Catholic influxes into the United States. And certainly in the mid-19th century, it didn't seem to be going terribly well. But then certainly towards the end of the 19th century, you do start to see, you know, more and more, I don't know if acceptance is the word. Certainly the Irish obtain more power. In 1880, you get the first Irish mayor of New York City, which was something that in 1850 wouldn't have been conceivable. And then you have, you know, other groups that start coming towards the end of the 19th century that you know, from Southern and Eastern Europe, that then seem to kind of pick up the mantle of how the Irish were treated as immigrants, you know, earlier in the century. And then so maybe by the end of the century, you know, maybe there was less discrimination against the Irish, but now there's more of this backlash against, you know, some of these other, you know, immigrant influxes. And to a certain extent, the Irish, you know, wave starts to end, and other groups, Italians and Greeks and Central European groups, at least relative to Europe, become much more, you know, much more meaningful.
And how much do you think language plays a part in that?
Well,
Which
you know,
is
it's
not in your
interesting.
account, because assimilation and the fact
Yeah.
that English is the...
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the Irish, because in studies that have been done and in some of my own research, relative to the Germans, you know, they don't seem to do so well. And you would have thought that the language would have been a relative advantage for, you know, the Irish in that circumstance. So certainly it is the case that, you know, speaking the language you would have thought would have been an advantage, you know, in terms of, again, how you measure occupation mobility and other things. But it is interesting that the Irish somewhat uniquely underperform their immigrant peer groups in kind of the mid to late 19th century. I mean, it is pretty interesting.
Well, I think that, you know, we've all kept perfectly to time, so I'm going to thank you all for being here for this session, and I'm very pleased to have been able to discuss two very interesting and very different papers together. Thank you.